Mr. President, General Professor, distinguished guests, the War Academy, established in 1889 by High Royal Decree of August the 8th. The founder was General Stefan Fulculano, the initiator and first organizer of the War Academy. The High Royal Decree was signed by King Charles I. Now hosts a debate of a study published by the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning, along with ISPRIM and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. With us, there are various chiefs of staff and their representatives, academics, researchers, various people who are knowledgeable about such as security, especially based on this study. The security challenges of our century, especially contemporary challenges, have been debated during the NATO summit, as well as in various other diplomatic formats. Without further ado, I would like to thank our distinguished guests for attending and invite Mr. Hans-Martin Sieg to address the audience. Mr. Hans-Martin Sieg is the manager of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. He's taken various positions in international organizations specializing in the security analysis. He's experienced in the post.
Thank you very much. Dear Minister, dear speakers, distinguished audience, on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I'm very happy to be here. Greet you all and see us that we've been supporting. We have a long and distinguished list of speakers, so this is the urge to add much, but in the beginning, perhaps a few sentences about why the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is supporting this event and think that this is also so high importance. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation, and one of the key issues we support is first transatlantic relations and European integration. And it is very obvious that on the area of security, the challenges are rising, and we have to recalibrate our alliances. We had a rather troubled experience over the last couple of years. Mr. Biden has just announced that America is back. The question is whether it really was ever absent, but it is very clear that international relations are shifting, that the United States is refocusing its attention more to Asia, which I think is a natural development, and it is not just tied to one administration. At the same time, the Europeans have quite more trouble on their own continent, and security challenges are rising. I'm more aware of that than Germans usually are. And I think it is paramount, and probably in this audience, not subject to any controversy, that the transatlantic relationship for European security is absolutely paramount. The question, however, is how to keep it stable, and this is very much also about the contribution of the Europeans. And here we have the big question, the white elephant in the room: to what extent European capacities would be built up in the future, eventually also in comparison to NATO. I think also in this audience we don't have much of a controversy that this needs to be complementary, but it is also, I think, not controversial that Europe in that respect has to meet its own commitments. Again, as a German, I would say, yes, some countries need to do more in that respect. In order also to make sure that our American allies remain committed, we need to be committed first. The challenges I don't need to explain. I think we are aware that on the European continent we have armed conflict at the moment, and there is no guarantee that they remain where they are. We as the Adenauer Foundation, again, are very committed to raise awareness, to strengthen our relationship and alliances. And this is why I thank our audience. This is why I thank our speakers and the contributors to the study for their work. And this is why I'm happy that we are having this debate today. Thank you very much on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Mr. Hans-Martin, and now we're going to give the floor to Mr. Natchez Bolshoi, the manager of the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning, and an academic himself. He participated in this study. The floor. Thank you very much, Commander. Let me say a few words on behalf of my institution, the entity who initiated this endeavor. First of all, I would like to thank our hosts, the Ministry of Defense, the National Defense University, Charles I, for showing openness and willingness, and for the logistic effort and support in organizing this event. I would also like to greet the presence of the Minister of Defense, because after all, our research has a very pragmatic use as well, and our hope is that we can at least give some food for thought for decision makers, given the challenges and issues that we want people to focus on. So the presence of decision makers is extremely important for our event. So we'd like to thank them for attending. Briefly, this is a research project that materialized in this study. This is a re-evaluation of the transatlantic relation, given the context represented by the change of the American administration, a Democrat president replacing a Republican one. The transatlantic relation has not been going over the past few years its greatest period. We had a former president with, let's say, a rather exotic approach, creating confusions, animosity. Well, the new Biden administration is confronted with the challenge of relaunching the transatlantic relation, or the overall atmosphere surrounding this transatlantic relation. You can think of the sinus curve so far. Then the essential Article 5 of the NATO treaty was debated and challenged, and that created tensions in this transatlantic relation. Despite the fact that we noticed the context is perfectly appropriate, I dare say, in mid-June we had a NATO summit, a EU-US summit, US-Russia summit. Our research started over 4 months ago, so there's a perfect timing. At the time when we started working on this, we were not aware that the sync would be so great. We've witnessed various progresses over the past month. A positive discourse should not be mistaken with a pragmatic approach in dealing with the transatlantic relation. Well, you are not here for an ex cathedra expose. Our fellow academics are not willing to just utter sentences. They want the issues to be debated very honestly, objectively, and at the same time, they will not ignore the elephant in the room, as you're going to see by reading the study. The context is very important. The context represented by creating this debate. So the outcome of our research, this study is open for you to look into. We are willing to take over ideas from you. You're invited to bring your input to enrich the ideas and the debate around this topic. Thank you very much again, our partners from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, for supporting this initiative. And I think it was a very opportune decision. Again, I'd like to thank our hosts for organizing and their support for organizing this event. I will get back to you presenting my piece of the study. I'm going to ask the commander to take the floor again. Thank you very much for these introductory words. I'd like to remind you that this debate is streamed online. There's a live YouTube broadcast on the Ministry of Defense channel. Thank you very much for accessing our platform. I saw Minister Melishkani attending. I'm honored to invite the Minister of Defense, to address. Good morning. Again, I am very honored to greet you. I'm extremely glad to be back in the event room of the National Defense University. I'm very glad to extend my thanks to all the people who were involved in this research and the study, especially to the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Mr. Kifo, I would also like to welcome and greet Professor Dungacho, the manager of the Institute for Foreign Studies and Military Policies. Also, Professor Notchis Boloshoyo for this achievement, the transatlantic relationship and the Biden administration. I am positive that the research study well ahead of the American president's tour, which we witness in high interest. The European tour was not even planned when this research started, so we can still anticipate important things, it appears. It is a very important feature for all those who are active in military institutions. We're all aware that success comes from the ability to anticipate. So, no further comments are needed. I'd also like to greet the Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Petrescu, the other Chiefs of Staff, academics involved in this activity. It's relevant for all of us to organize events such as this one. Debate, formal or informal environments, I emphasized the importance of adapting to this dynamic of change occurring not just in the military field, but also in everything related to society. And at the same time, I emphasize the utmost importance of academic institutions, in particular the National Defense University, to be the engine, the driving force behind taking over learnings from history and tradition, taking over those elements of continuity, but at the same time, their ability to generate change and adaptation and implement new concepts generated by new equipment, technologies, and state-of-the-art technologies. As I was saying, I don't think we need to go any further into the opportunity of this research and the outcome, the study. They come in perfect sync with recent events in the past 2 weeks. Major summits, the bilateral meeting between President Biden and President Putin. All of these are elements that made the agenda of all the interested parties who were very eager to witness how these events progress. Of course, the outcomes of all these events are still witnessed and understood in time. They will still be effects, at least in the medium run, but also in the long run. There have been effects in the short run, of course. We could see the ambassadors of the two powers were sent back to Moscow and Washington, respectively, which is a sign of for normalizing the relationships based on the need to continue to carry on dialogue at all levels. At the same time, it is very important and worth mentioning that this study describes and anticipates our opinion quite accurately. The relationship, the transatlantic relationship, it is perfectly written study in the literature of this field. We can say we really needed this. We still need a study like this. Professor Bolshoi was saying that it is still open to further input and contributions to new ideas and new content that might be relevant to specifically to the echo of President Biden's tour in Europe, we can say that it has represented an opportunity to set a new positive agenda, as I was saying earlier, for everything related to transatlantic relations. There have been strong, firm statements regarding the firm commitment of the US towards Europe. Those were quite unequivocal statements. The fact that they reconfirmed the utmost importance of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is quite encouraging for all of us. And if I remember well, President Biden mentioned that it is a sacred commitment towards complying with the provisions of Article 5. In fact, we can understand from this quite clearly the relevance of transatlantic relations as regarded by the US in respect of the European Union. At the same time, I think it is important to mention that the same encouraging message was put forward by President Biden during the B9 summit. He emphasized quite clearly the relevance of the eastern flank, and especially the relevance of the Black Sea on the eastern flank. In fact, it is further proof of the fact that all these elements that are of major concern to us, that we keep debating whenever we have an opportunity to organize events both in academic and institutional format. All these elements are in our planning documents, in our national defense strategy, in the government's white book, in the military strategy. Our security relies on three pillars: NATO member, EU member, and the strategic partnership with the USA. It is also worth mentioning, and I wanted to bring this to your attention, namely that based on their foreign agenda, the Biden administration wants from the very beginning to put it that way, the renewal of the Transatlantic Alliance, which he considers, and I quote, the starting point new things in the 21st century. Are quite clear messages in terms of the transatlantic relation. In fact, the Biden administration reiterated the importance of multilateralism and brought to the climate agreement in Paris, also back to the World Health Organization, rejoining the global initiative for anti-COVID vaccination. All of these represent good premises for redefining the cooperation between the US and the EU, for facing global challenges and reforming multilateralism based on joint values. From Romania's perspective, transatlantic relations represent the key element of rules-based international order and based on international cooperation to manage current challenges. I think it is also worth mentioning that within the European Union as well, quite important decisions have been made recently in this respect, at least in terms of all European Union members agreed that the US, Canada, and Norway can join in projects in this format. So the first initiative is that of military mobility. So there are concrete proofs that these political statements it is quite obvious at the same time that among European leaders and American leaders, there is a major concern for overcoming all problems created by the pandemic. In fact, we could all learn that it is only by strengthening this relationship that we can look into future economic reshuffling, also in terms of all decisions related to the environment and climate change, commercial and technological cooperation, and last but not least, strengthening peace and security globally. Considering the strategic importance of the bilateral partnership with the United States and our position as a EU member, Romania constantly supported the consolidation of our profile as a security provider in all our initiatives and decisions made in this respect. Our country has a fundamental interest in further developing sound transatlantic relations and, of course, in supporting with no reservations a relaunch of the transatlantic dialogue. While the cooperation agenda between the EU and the US is quite vast, with a major focus on commerce and trade, we must notice that in this dialogue, security and defense take more and more importance and visibility. For the US, NATO stays as the main pillar of transatlantic security. And as President Biden has emphasized, the European Union is a major player not just in managing economic aspects, but also in supporting this North Atlantic alliance in its endeavors. There are positive elements marking a change of paradigm in practical cooperation between the two parties. Among the most recent progress, we can name the EU approval of US participating in the first PESCO project dedicated to military mobility, as well as stating the interest in projects such as medical support, cyber response, and the American participation in the EU crisis management exercise. It's worth mentioning at the same time the USA's interest in participating in the activities of the European Defense Agency, the main European entity supporting member states in their defense endeavors. I don't think we can talk about a conclusion, at least not yet, for the summit, the EU-US summit, but we believe that at the end of this summit, a major step towards reinforcing transatlantic dialogue against the NATO backdrop opens further cooperation opportunities, starting from a ambitious shared agenda, with the major objective being identifying responses to major global concerns. The joint contribution of the EU and US can make a difference in this global context. I think that this event is quite significant for us. And we should identify means whereby to benefit from the results and turn to good account the outcome of this research, so that all of these political statements can materialize in practical realities, as we say, our military say, in the field. I would like to point out one more thing related to India's support for the European Union's aspiration towards becoming a major security player. And I'm not just saying that as a statement, as a political statement, but taking into account everything that has been achieved in Romania, in our commitments, the steps we have taken towards this adaptation to change of our Ministry of Defense and its institutions, and all of the steps we have taken in this respect. And I believe that all of our commitments, all of our efforts so far to secure 2% of our GDP for defense purposes for 4 consecutive years. This is the 5th year since we've been doing that. represents a sound proof that everything we have committed to is in full consonance with the decisions made across the European Union and NATO as well. In fact, I started by saying that Romania understands the relevance of the European commitment towards becoming a strategic player in terms of security. So it is important to emphasize we must look at both NATO and the EU's efforts as being complementary. We're not talking about rivalry or competition. We must identify the paths to follow so that we can emphasize the complementary nature of decisions that will make an impact on implementing new capabilities to military institutions. Of course, we're not just talking about military institutions. Lately, we've been talking a lot about resilience, and I think it is important in this respect to identify solutions that can find their part to play in terms of complementarity. In this respect, it's important to emphasize two approaches. First, there's a NATO-based process, the NATO 2030 project, and another one, EU-based, towards the strategic compass. These two endeavors must also find common ground and be relevant in supporting in each other. It is quite obvious that the two endeavors are open, and I think in the end they will identify the perfect formula to identify this common ground that I referred to. For us, it is quite important to state that it is a key moment in our bilateral relation with the United States. It's been 10 years of strategic partnership between the USA and Romania, and it's been 5 years since the facility in Deveselu was made operational and integrated in response capacities of anti-ballistic missile NATO defense system. I am positive that our chiefs of staff will point out the other elements of the bilateral relations in terms of joint activities and, of course, U.S. investment in developing the air bases in Câmpia Turzii and Mihail Cogălnicianu. And since we're in this format, I think we can thank our predecessors for the decisions that they made at the time, anticipating, having the power, the ability to anticipate back then the relevance of the two air bases. Consequently, I would very much like for all of us To be able to look ahead in time and make decisions to impact future generations to benefit from a safe security environment. I would like to thank all people involved in this research and thank you all for attending actively. And you will make your contribution towards finalizing this research. And professors, looking forward for you to bring new such initiatives and challenges. We're assuring you that the National Defense University, with the transformational process undertaken by the Romanian army, will have to turn into a think tank where ideas and concepts will meet expectations in terms of the challenges and the dynamic of our everyday lives. They have a very strong impact in military terms, and we can see today the world leaders' preoccupation for our capacity to cope with technological progress, new disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, and how all of these are implemented and can be used for security and defense purposes, and so on and so forth. I think all of these must go beyond academic debates. They must be turned to good account as decisions in each individual institution. It is also important to underline that such a study must be taken beyond the limits of the National Defense University, because if we're really concerned with resilience, and it should cover a major segment of our preoccupations, which is why it must start from each individual citizen and go up to high decision-making levels, both governmental and non-governmental. We're always open to support you in such endeavors. Thank you very much again. Success. I wish you success.
Thank you, Minister. Our National Defense University remains a forum for debate and for interinstitutional education. This is one of our missions. Further on, I would like to give the floor to General Lieutenant Petrescu, Chief of Staff of Defense, a constant presence both here at the National Defense College and in other courses of our university, and we're glad that he was able to attend this event of our university as well. Thank you, Minister, distinguished guests. I should have expected to be invited to say a couple of words. I wanted to listen to the findings of your study and then to say a couple of words, but since I was given the floor now, let me underline the cooperation between the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning and our own institute inspiring the University of Defense and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I think this is a momentous event, and I hope that based on this, we will move on with relevant planning documents. Last year, we underwent a planning event, a strategic analysis, strategic review of the field of defense, and I was thinking that it would have been really useful to have such partnerships in such important moments. It is good that we are having such discussions, such debates, and I'm expecting that these debates and the findings of these debates are taken over in our and reflected in our planning documents. This is what I wanted to say. As the minister talked about the concepts such as the strategic planning for NATO, EU's defense, EU's strategic compass, and so on. Last year, we presented the white paper for defense and a new strategy, all based on that process of strategic review that I was mentioning. And I think that both at national, NATO, and EU level, this way of conducting and managing the strategic review and the strategic documents is going to influence our very relevance as part of these international institutions in the upcoming period. The second aspect that I wanted to touch upon has to do with the relevance of the transatlantic relationship. Obviously, your study is most relevant, and obviously, we should continue speaking about this transatlantic relationship. The minister was saying that I would speak about the influence um, of the transatlantic relationship on the development of our capabilities. Well, I think this influence starts from the concept level and then translates and is reflected into anything from endowment projects, separate programs, or projects. And since we're talking about the importance of these concepts, what we are doing in NATO with the deterrence and defense concept, the new strategy of the transatlantic alliance, what we're doing in the EU, the mobility, military mobility projects, and so on, everything that has been discussed so far, everything is influenced by the way in which this transatlantic relationship works. And I think that these changes that are taking place now, multilateralism is given another chance that needs to be put to good use. And our national defense strategy, drafted before the elections in the US and before the start of the pandemic, and then throughout the pandemic, mentions the role uh, of multilateral cooperation formats and bilateral formats and the way in which they are going to take place. I think these bilateral formats continue to hold their importance. I'm talking about the B9 and other formats. This is why we need to be able to analyze very accurately against a bilateral, multilateral background, what is it that can help us best to reach our strategic goals. So I'm looking forward to listening to the discussions concerning your study. Thank you very much for inviting me and for inviting me to take the floor. And I'm convinced that this event is useful for everyone present here and for everyone who is involved in the planning process. Thank you. Thank you, Jamal. Further on, for 40 minutes, we will listen to the authors of the study. And then we will have a Q&A session. I have two colleagues in the room who will be handing microphones because I've seen you taking notes. This being said, without any further ado, let me give the floor to Mr. Kifo, who works here at our university and also is president of the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning. Before Professor Kifo takes the floor, I will have to apologize. At 11 o'clock, I will have to leave, so I will apologize in advance because there is a government meeting. So once again, I apologize. Minister, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by extending my thanks for organizing this excellent event, which is a partnership with the National Defense Unit, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and General Petrescu. Let me tell you that there are at least 3 people present here around this table who took part in the strategic review, the drafting of the national defense strategy. This has been a major concern for us in the first part of last year. So we believe that we are part of this process, and I think that this should be applauded. And I'm glad that the military and defense institution that has a very important role to this end invites us for such events every now and again. Furthermore, we have had numerous such experiences and such moments, and I think they were very good events. I remember the conference on military thinking on resilience. I mean, resilience was not necessarily a new concept. I think I've been in the board of this magazine since its inception. But let us remember the fact that we were doing this in 2019. So we are in line with the general thinking. As far as this project is concerned, let me tell you a couple of things that have to do with some matters of principle. It is very complicated for an academic arena, which is characterized by a certain depth and perhaps not high flexibility. It is sometimes difficult to adapt to the pace with which things have happened, because this Biden's tour in Europe had nothing to do with our planning. We started some 6 months ago, then 3 months ago we started actually writing after going through the literature, and then we had a first event last week at the Diplomatic Institute, and Biden hadn't finished his tour. So some reflections are more recent because they are based on more recent events, such as the Biden-Putin summit. Furthermore, yesterday we had a meeting for the Council of External Affairs discussing the document on the EU-Russia relations, and on the 24th we're going to have debates on this topic in the European Council. So there is a certain pace of these events and a decision, rapid pace. Another aspect of context, another element of context has to do with the fact that we need to focus on documents more and more. Documents are not absolute and are not to be taken as such, because how they're implemented is also important. the negotiation formula is important, the previous stances and so on, but I believe that the study of documents is becoming a more and more important endeavor for this university as well, and for any study of this kind, because they are the basis for such endeavors and discussions. So let us talk about the Rome meeting in 2017, when they started a reflection process on the future of NATO, which concluded in the summit in Sibiu in 2019. So this already provides a database of reporting on the relations between the NATO component and the EU component in terms of defense. And this is what laid the basis for complementarity and cooperation, which was translated into a center of excellence in Helsinki on hybrid threats. Equally, there are many elements that were added afterwards, subsequently, and our analysis covered this period, but will before the Biden's tour, but will cover some aspects related to it. Our study covers both areas of convergence between the two approaches, the NATO and the EU approach, and the areas of divergence, and as well as two aspects that we added, such as the EU-US summit and the Putin-Biden summit. With respect to areas of convergence and divergence, I have been a bit more nuanced as I referred to convergence, elements of convergence, but I also discussed aspects that have to do with nuance, diversity, and democracy, because this is where we find the very clear elements that are the basis for the new multilateralism. Differences and nuances, all the against a common basis, a common background. Furthermore, we have looked into the elements of divergence and difference. Again, this is a nuanced approach. As the study has shown that there are far more divergence within each state in terms of nuances of approach, and within the EU more than there are between the EU on the one hand and respectively NATO on the other hand. There are many steps that have been made. I have looked at the programs measures, interim strategic guidance on for national security of President Biden, and all these documents show and mention some aspects that have to do with economy, with bilateral trade, as well as profound strategic elements. Along in all these fields, the approaches are similar. If you look at the European Commission's communications in April 2019 on China and the final statements of the Paris summit, Macron, Merkel, Juncker, Tusk and Xi Jinping, you will see that those documents fully cover the document sent by the White House in December concerning relations with China, and the the latest periodic assessment of the relations between U.S. and China. The substance is similar. However, there are differences in nuance in terms of wording, because the wording is more direct and at times more tough during the Trump administration, at least, and respectively a more nuanced approach in the EU documents. The basis has to do with our common shared history, with the participation of the United States in the two world wars, on providing, on the fact that the US is involved, heavily involved in providing security for Europe, because this was the basis starting with the Marshall Plan. Apart from which, and this defense goes beyond the that nuclear umbrella, the indivisibility of security has been once again reaffirmed by President Biden. And there is a reference to Romania in both meetings, the B91 and respectively the visit of President Iohannis in the US back in 2017. So once again, shared values, shared history, shared pragmatic and security interests, as well as the security and risk assessment agenda. There are elements and there is a convergence against this in this field. And I have to say that there are two new elements as well. One that has to do with the real value-based multilateralism, a concept that stems from the US as they realize that they are no longer the absolute dominating power, while being concerned with rule observance. There is this need of a coagulation of democratic forces, and on the other hand, there is a need of a real multilateralism, because this coagulation of democratic forces is the only one that can see to it that the new rules are imposed at global level, and as well that the observance of these new rules can be enforced. Further on, both France and Germany are committed to this multilateralism. Multilateralism, the real multilateralism, is also a very natural concept, because let us not forget that the Soviet Union at its peak was only 40% of the GDP of the United States, whereas China is comparable with the United States in this regard, and furthermore aspiring to overtake it. So when we speak about Russia, there is a very direct treatment with a range of sanctions and so on, and it is mentioned in various documents, and the EU documents, the United States EU document, NATO documents, and so on, but China is treated in a more nuanced way. The divergence has to do with the effort of trust that the US needs to undertake, because once the election of a president led to such an important, such a deep change, it is very, very difficult to get back with the election of a new president to get back to the previous situation. So this is why there is this area or margin of relative mistrust. Although one needs to underline that during the Trump administration, the American establishment continued to function, so that there were no major changes in this regard. In terms of area of divergence as well, there are nuances as far the relationship with China is concerned as well. Although the basis of the approach is more or less the same. For example, the EU announced some sanctions or announced that they're going to support in analysis, a full in-depth analysis of the source of the coronavirus. But if the while the US wants to hold China accountable, including in financial terms, the EU wants to treat this more as a lesson learned. So once again, we're talking about differences of nuance rather than radical differences. In particular, if we think about the interdependence with China, which is both a major producer and a major market. With respect to the relations between the EU and the United States, again, the paradigm is that of multilateralism. I have counted myself some 7 working groups that add, according to the European method, they do some fine-tunings of these relations, be it in terms of China or Russia or other aspects. There are these working groups which have the purpose of creating a normative power with global relevance while using EU's capacity to reach consensus with a range of actors. As far as Romania's position is concerned, the determining element, the most important element, which I have reiterated throughout the past 10 years, is our approach is don't make us choose. Romania continues to be the most pro-Euro-Atlantic state, but equally continues to be a staunch supporter of the European Union and also a supporter of this convergence so that any possible differences that may exist be addressed as part of a consensus mechanism. Along these dimension, I think the latest decisions, the most recent decisions of the Council for External Affairs are important. And the partner states are also important. Upon Romania's initiative, we introduced frozen and protracted conflicts, and we introduced some aspects on strategic cooperation with Eastern Partnership countries, in particular Ukraine, Georgia, and Republic of Moldova, as they have already some agreements signed. This is not an assurance, but does lead to some openness and help and fosters the relationship with these partners, in particular with respect to the area of defense, because let us not forget that the biggest gap or the difference is democracies versus autocracies. The EU does not see a formula for aligning with the United States with respect to this approach, but rather of finding a common denominator with respect to China, but also with respect to other global democracies, in particular the Indo-Pacific ones. So yes, we're looking forward to the future strategic concept, where we expect to see a leap towards a global nature. I do remember the Lisbon debate on a new strategic concept in the Albright Commission. I was a representative of Romania at the time, and there was a debate of this kind, although the basis may have been less visible. But today, such a leap towards a global NATO is indeed more likely, and the presence of China in these documents and discussions will indeed is indeed a sign that China will become a concern for the transatlantic alliance as well. Furthermore, Romania will need to find a niche for contributing and for assisting our strategic American partner. I hope that I have not taken too much of your time, and I thank you for your attention.
Launched quite during the speech. I am very honored to give the floor to Professor Konrad, sociologist, Bucharest, of the master's program in security studies at that university, to present a few conclusions. If I may, Professor, this study, I lots of highly challenging items in terms of foreign policy, and not only. On the concept of strategic autonomy, which is extremely well defined for Europe and the European Union, I would like to emphasize the following statement. Despite European dissatisfactions, the battle with China also is concerned with the status of the United States as the world power. Professor, I would like to begin by thanking you for this invitation and for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you concerning an event and the event of this tour in Europe. I can't help the ironic side of it. Forecast that has earth flying as part of its name. It's a joke, of course. So, an invitation to being realistic. I would like to thank you for the vision and I was identified. My brain under the pressure of remember what they were saying, let China sleep because if it wakes up, it'll shake. The UN, the Transatlantic Partnership, and its chances and the Russian strategic. First of all, the Transatlantic Partnership. Realistically speaking, this partnership has been working conditions. First, a joint enemy, and secondly, acknowledging the American. Whenever either items ownership was not fully functional. That's what happened when Europe was a protectorate during the Cold War. Communism, it worked. Everybody regarded globalization as a fatality. It was considered natural. In Fukuyama's terms, that was the end of history in the West. The world was regarded as a single unit. When Bill Clinton patted Boris's back saying, Boris, don't fight it, we're going to be in the same boat, which is globalization. Things more complicated. During President Bush's time, when Europeans felt a very good opportunity to show their reticence towards the Americans at certain times, 9/11 made us all we triggered the provision the U.S. against terrorism. Russia joined the effort. This didn't take long because in 2003, with the invasion in Iraq, Europeans went to the streets in all European capitals saying we're Europeans, we're not Americans. And there was an attempt to justify across Europe how Europe is different from America structurally. Various articles were published in Spain, the UK, and Germany, and various other countries about such differences between Europe and the US. That's when they brought on the table the concept of old Europe, new Europe, how old Europe was tired, lacking strategic warmth. And in 2014, everybody joined in with sanctions against Russia. During the Obama administration, the Transatlantic Partnership was a thing on paper. In reality, it never operated because there was no identified and acknowledged enemy, and the American leadership was rather represented by Obama's leadership, not the US as a whole. So then the concept of strategic autonomy. Unfortunately, Obama's foreign policy project prepared the ground for the Trump administration and his 2016 speech contesting everything as being costly, China, and generating anti-Americanism. That's how he referred to the Transatlantic Partnership. From this perspective, this is where we are today. The premises of this study is that the chances for the transatlantic partnership are related to China. There are two preconditions here. Acknowledge China as an enemy, and recognize America as a leader position. If this doesn't happen, unfortunately, again, this is going to stay on paper, whether we like it or not, whether we want it or not. Of course, we're talking about multilateralism today, but this is a elegant term from my point. Multilateralism, speaking of Biden's visit to Europe, that all parties meet, debate, and produce projects with a predetermined project. There was an article in Washington Post announcing a project when Biden met the European actors, he knew who the enemies were, who the friends were, and what the project should be from now on. Maybe, but that's not exactly the dictionary definition of multilateralism. And that is a challenge for Europeans, a challenge which they may accept or not. America's problem is not represented by Russia and China. It's mainly China. Russia can be managed. China is a challenge that we must all face, ideologically, militarily, and technologically. That was why everyone was joined at the table. G7, the European Union, NATO, and the Russian Federation, other dimensions. But everybody, I think, had China on their mind, even during the Biden-Putin summit. Let me remind you, the only time the two leaders shook hands, not touched elbows, was when Biden and Putin met. We're still shy of shaking hands here. But the meeting between Biden and Putin started with a firm handshake. Everybody else, it was a very significant handshake. For whoever knows the reality in the Russian Federation, I can assure you that they'll keep playing that handshake in Russia until their general elections. It was the general feeling that the Russian president was finally in the picture. That picture, that big picture that Russia has been dreaming of ruling the world. What an opportunity, which I'm not sure the Russian president, as a president, will ever have again. So this is the sign under which multilateralism is going to work. And transatlantic multilateralism, that it's not something going upwards from the bottom level. If it is to work, it should go both ways, downwards as well. My feeling is this: it's a bit too early to have very clearly marked statements. It's one thing what you see and another thing what you do. I don't mean to be very opposing, but I have seen this in this material from an Eastern point of view. As we want to regret President Bush, who was not a star. I really don't want us to reach a position where we are going to regret Trump. From my point of view, the comparison between the Obama administration and the Trump administration is unfortunately not very favorable to the Obama administration. The number of military exercises decreased. No lethal weapons were sold to Ukraine. During the Trump administration, there were more exercises, more American money going to the eastern flank. American troops went to the eastern flank. President Trump even promised that with all American troops populate the eastern flank, they did sell lethal weapons to Ukraine. So if it comes to it, things are not that despite rhetoric. Rhetoric was Obama's side. Reality was Trump's side. We're still waiting to see, but we must keep in mind that frequently all of these documents, buttoned up and very formal, must also be regarded through the lens of reality. You only learn that the cookie is good after you've eaten it, to quote President Biden's press conference. Especially on the southern end of the eastern flank, We're going to see if this cookie of the partnership was good or not. Related to China, I'm not going to insist on that. We have to watch what's going on. Lately, we've started consulting the press media press. What they write in Chinese press is way tougher than what they have ever written about the US. They oppose Biden for his pressure on China. Biden's international community is a lot smaller than China's international community. You're not entitled to do such a thing. So the tone is extremely tough, very close to the hottest moments. China is trying to stand its ground. China understood the premises for this entire relaunch is China and is getting ready. Very quickly about the Russian Federation. Other centers, 22% of Russian streets to protest for economic reasons. Only 16%. His popularity is 20%. Popularity is 60%. So the idea that Russia must take care of Mr. Navalny's life is a message that changes the West should be concerned about political dissidents not to go to prison rather than to watch for them to stay alive in prison. The political message for the Russian Federation was, I'm sorry to say, almost a disaster. Apart from the fact that the summit, the Russia-US summit did take place, that was unprecedented, that was good. But the kind of political pressure against Russia, I think, should be more consistent, because otherwise, coupled with not inviting Ukraine for that summit, funding Ukraine so that you can say that you fund them, but not sufficiently so that they can represent any threat to Russia. So the lack of very clear, firm messages close to the eastern flank is not a good sign. From this point of view, the Romanian diplomacy and the Romanian military diplomacy has a very important mission, a complex yet very important mission, to draw attention to the progress of events in this region. What happens in the Ukraine, what happens in after the elections in Moldova, we're 400 kilometers away. How much of Russia is going to be found in Ukraine? How much of Russia is going to be found in the Republic of Moldova? We are highly concerned of that, because Russian domination in that area could easily come to life with the federalization of those regions without a single shot. Speaking of strategic autonomy, are we talking about the strategic autonomy of Europe or the European Union? In other words, is the UK part of this concept or not? I think the Biden administration would be very happy for the European Union to commit to securing the continent. We have other jobs to do. Get the Europeans along with them in China, they would come in the way. Can Europeans secure the European continent? Europe only exists geographically. Strategically, Europe does not exist. Strategic positions of Europe, but if you look at the elections in France 2 days ago, the first that Mr. Macron underperform worse than the worst fears, you will see Mr. Macron change his line of discourse, getting back to the good old populism that made him famous. Is this good news or not? We're yet to see. But Europe depends a lot on the political decisions of its leaders. Hence, it's very hard to make any forecast. Yes. The chance. It stands the chance to commit to a transatlantic partnership under American leadership, trying to secure the European flank of NATO by cooperation and by making it more compatible. The fact that each European nation buys weapons chaotically without joining forces, that's not a good thing. So Europe has a task. Make sure what you wish for, because it might turn true. So from this point of view, Romania is somewhere in between, trying to get the two banks of the Atlantic together. And Romania hopes that no one is going to ask her, who do you love more, mommy or daddy? Come from a different direction. And I'm a sociologist. Well, generations have changed in Romania too. Committing to the strategic partnership with the US is not the same as what it used to be in the 90s. The idea of security is no longer the same as in the 90s, whether we like it or not. In America, very few people think that Russia is a threat. Politically, Democrats are rather anti-Trump than anti-Russian. Right now, in Romania, if you look at surveys, and we must be very realistic, the European Union is gaining ground compared to the strategic partnership with the US. And if we look at who is more pro-European, and white collars will favor Europe, especially Germany, and blue collars or older people prefer the US. This is a reality that in time becomes significant politically. There's a change generation, but there's an economic. There's no American money, not enough American money in the Romanian economy. For the new generations, Russia is not a concern. They don't have this obsession of the Russian threat. They look at other things. So we must rethink this partnership if we want to reinforce it, also in terms of popular choices. They will inform a political implementation of those choices in the coming years. My contribution to this report. Thank you very much again for allowing me to join you. I'm open to questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dungaciu. Next speaker says, quote from the document, with respect to the term of President Trump, the new American discourse was perceived as a source of inspiration by various leaders in Europe as they were praising the role of nationalists, which led to a wave of populism, which led to a wave of populism and Euroscepticism. They slightly contradict what Professor said, but this being said, allow me to give the floor to Ms. Carmen Roșnovanu, researcher and expert and director of the Institute for the Study of Military Affairs of our university. Allow me to take the mask down. Thank you. Thank you, General Thank you, General Petrescu, distinguished guests. It is a pleasure for me to be here. It is the first time that I'm speaking from this table, and it is a very good feeling. The concept of this project, as underlined by the previous speakers, was to try to identify and decipher some aspects that need to be followed closely as far as the transatlantic relationship is concerned. In other words, aspects that may lead to challenges, because as it has been underlined, there are some dossiers that need to be followed closely. As such, I will try to touch upon some elements of interest. I have to admit that some of the central points have been touched upon already by my colleagues, but I will try to elaborate on some of the ideas that may have been mentioned. We're discussing that we actually finalized this document before the Biden's diplomatic tour de force in Europe was concluded. Although, and in spite of that, some of our conclusions were confirmed by what happened in Biden's summits and meetings. Our own conclusions were more or less similar to one another. We did not, although we did not intended to necessarily, but we realized that our conclusions were more, for the most part, similar. Even though some of the aspects that I'm going to mention will seem to repeat what my colleagues have said already, I think it is important to have a nuanced perspective of the transatlantic relationship, which is very important and complicated, but also extremely relevant for the transatlantic security, for the global security, and particularly for us as a country. My contribution focused on two aspects. The first one having to do with the impact of Trump's strategy and policies on the transatlantic relations, and prospects during Biden's term. I'll try to group them. I also explained them in our first meeting last week, but I will try to make a brief summary of the essential elements that I have tried to underline in this study. Firstly, as it has been said, after when Biden took over, this was took office, this was followed by a wave of optimism in Europe, in Romania included. I think we needed this enthusiasm after a rather delicate and complex period as far as the transatlantic relationship is concerned. Essentially, if we look at the first 6 months of Biden's first term, I see two major lines of action that justify this optimism and enthusiasm. The first has to do with the return of the US to the traditional paradigm as responsible global actor, engaged and committed to managing the big global dossiers, and not on its own, but together with partners. So this is a change that is expected and wanted by European partners and allies. It was good to see that the US is taking on a global leader role, and once again, not on its own, but in cooperation with its European partners, and not only against this background of a new multilateralism. So once again, America is back, taking over the coordination of these most important dossiers. The second line of action, which has generated optimism, has to do with the firm re-engagement of the United States uh, with respect to the transatlantic relationship. Article 5, commitment to European security. So I'm talking about that type of discourse that we all needed to hear. And if we look at the Biden's discourse as of his first hours of the first hours of his term, right after he won, one of the central elements that he underlined had to do with the importance of the transatlantic relationship and of the Article 5 for the US. So it was an effort made by Washington to try to restore trust, because this is, I believe, the aim of this message, to help regain some of the trust that was lost over the previous 4 years. And also another aim had to do with doing away with uncertainty, which was prevalent during Trump's term. And I'll only mention a couple of aspects with respect to the impact of Trump's term. There are a number of elements. I will not go into details now, but I do agree with what has been said, namely that the actions taken during Trump's term with respect to defense and deterrence were significant. Once again, I will not go into details, as the previous speakers have given already some examples to this end. But if I am to look at the general image of what has been done during his term, in particular with respect to strengthening the relations with the transatlantic partners, I would say that they were quite reassuring, in particular to those in the eastern part of Europe. However, there was an issue between that had to do with a discrepancy between actions and discourse, which led to a certain level of concern and worries. Uh, just to mention a couple of aspects, I would like to mention the ambivalence with respect to Article 5, conditioning uh, along the lines of you can participate if you pay, which led indeed to some concern and worry. And once again, this led to some level of uncertainty. So there was this mindset, all right, he'll help us, but what if he changes his mind in the next 48 hours? So what happened is that President Biden won, and if we look at all the messages that he has received since he has been sending since he took over, the aim is to regain at least some of this lost trust. And in order to do this, one important effort has to do with being predictable. Predictability and trust. President Biden understood this, and The messages, his messages focused a great deal on this. Apart from the optimistic messages, however, I would like to touch upon some coordinates that seem to define the position of the United States. On the one hand, the request to increase the contribution to the defense budget, this will remain unchanged. Once again, this is not something that someone came up with or President Trump came up with, but this has been the stance of the United States for a while with respect to burden sharing. Second, the United States has a clear interest to direct NATO to the global scene. There is a focus on engagement, on consultations, on dialogue, on coordinating positions, and I would say that this focus on the political, the more soft dimension of the alliance, is also part of this effort of building a global platform for action, where NATO would play an important role. A focus on this global agenda could have several implications, and I would only like to mention two of them, which are very important for us. On the one hand, we're talking about furthering the expansion of the alliance towards east, and strengthening the infrastructure on the eastern flank apart from what is in place already. As it has been said already, there are a number of aspects that need to be monitored very closely. Apart from these possible implications, which need to be followed very closely, I'd also agree with what has been said before me, namely that irrespective of what happens next, the global approach and global perspective is going to define the strategic thinking of decision makers in Washington, and it's not necessarily a choice for them. They don't really have a choice. So basically, we're talking about China. This is also part of this aspect is addressed in the conclusions of my part of the study. This is a very important aspect, as it has to do with the future of the global posture of the United States and of the role of the United States in this new international order. This systemic competition between the United States and China is going to define the role of the United States on the global arena, we like it or not. And if we are to look at the statement of the NATO summit in Brussels, China is referred in the same syntagm with a systemic challenge. The way I see it, well, of course, terminology matters a great deal. Systemic challenge means more than Russia, although Russia is mentioned about 60 times throughout the document. Systemic challenge has an entirely different meaning and linguistic and conceptual and impact and practical impact, because it says a great deal about what China means for the United States. And I tend to share this idea that the way in which the transatlantic partnership is going to be shaped against the background of this competition is going to influence the future of the relations between the EU and the US, the future of the engagement of the United States in the European security, and so on. And one more thing, it is clear that the new strategy of President Biden with respect to China, the Transatlantic Partnership plays a key role. It is very unlikely that the US are able to manage this without the support of European allies and without building on the basis of the Transatlantic Partnership. And I think this is an important window of opportunity for us. What is not clear for me is to which extent the United States and the EU are going to harmonize their agendas concerning China, to which extent the EU is going to, or indeed willing to, align fully to the US position concerning China. Because if this does not happen, I think this will heavily impact the transatlantic relationship. I have seen some positive signals. There is interest, there is commitment, engagement, and so on. There's willingness to find that common denominator in this respect. But once again, we need to be fully aware that the position of the two sides, namely EU and US concerning China, is not fully convergent. There is and is not fully harmonized, and the way in which this divergence is going to be addressed will again heavily impact on the future of the transatlantic relationship. Thank you.
Time allotted. But how can we write such distinct or as their now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Natchez Balashoyu, the Executive Manager of the Center for Conflict Prevention and Early Warning. And as part of this study, with bed control, since I graduated from the Economic Studies Academy, their accountant's view to the elements behind a very positive statement about the transatlantic relationship. It's positive, it's a step forward, fine, but there's a but. I tried this network and items to cut out some elements to show why this debate is relevant and why it is fit to keep a sober, realistic, and objective attitude, and not a rather pessimistic one, which I witnessed. Our own ambition to put things in perspective, in a coherent and realistic perspective. We have seen that in the transatlantic relation there are many convergence points, but on the other hand, we have, let's call them, lack of consonance. I'm trying to avoid mentioning diverging elements. The key elements for that: Russia, China, withdrawal from the INF Treaty, Iran. Let's look at the nuances. If we are talking about Russia, more and more assertive Russia is concerned, we that cooperation stop this self-assertive development of Russia's extremely aggressive attitude. In fact, that was the tone we found in President Joe Biden's speech, his summits and unions earlier this month. He reasserted the American commitment to values and the world order formed by the Russian Federation. And this brought to the debate the fact that President Biden seemed too mild compared to the pragmatic field reality. I criticized the fact that Ukraine was not invited. Some criticism was made of the fact that despite Ukraine had corruption issues, which was an obstacle in becoming a member of NATO, now currently the government is downgraded, not given the accession map, the roadmap, because they have this corruption issue. Now they're talking about Georgia. On paper, things look, and in statements, things look very positive for Georgia, but Georgia's progress on the Euro-Atlantic path is highly positive. Is that the enthusiasm that Georgia used to have might decrease. It's quite visible that Georgia has been quite silent on this topic. On the other hand, there are European actors who don't find this hardline approach a beneficial one. Hardline approach that would involve more sanctions against Russia. So if sanctions don't reach the target, then this approach should be rediscussed. There are things that we must look at quite openly and honestly. We have the Baltic states on the eastern flank, we have the southern flank with quite a history regarding the Russian Federation. It's quite natural that the southern part of the flank require more a harder approach towards the Russian Federation. There is some sense of irritability in relation to Russia because we don't have the capacity to influence all of these decisions, and there's this fear that agreements are made and reached beyond our comprehension. Not all can be done, so I would still open a bottle of champagne. The New Start and weapons of European allies regarded the INF was regarded as one of the pillars of the European security architecture. After 2019 and the administration withdrew from the INF, we made some European leaders to say that but now some Europeans recognize that the US was justified withdrawing from the INF because Russia did not need its INF. We say talk about a new start. Another so the new start was extended for another 5 years. Last minute in February, the old was about to expire. us to work on it as a debate, but the topic that cannot be avoided in this debate. The American national strategy quote that represents the cornerstone of the American attitude towards what Beijing is doing in its neighborhood. Beijing earns a strategic base in Europe by extending its unfair commercial practices, sensitive technologies, and infrastructure. The 5G issue, Americans were very frank in saying that a potential involvement of Chinese technology companies, Huawei more specifically, not welcome and appreciated by the United States, and that it can even endanger the information exchange with the US. So prohibiting such Chinese technology companies in strategically related projects is a key component. The European Commission and Cybersecurity Agency launched a public guideline to avoid high-risk suppliers, inviting Europeans to avoid on a single technology supplier. There are concerns related to China, but they're not talking about excluding Chinese companies. The economic dimension and presence of China in Europe, there are states that are more vulnerable to this, but Western Europe is not safe from the investment appetite of China. I'm talking about the Eurossport Greece. I'm talking about how Italy in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, joined the Belt and Road project, which created a lot of dissatisfaction. And the summit earlier this month, we can see that the US doesn't spare any effort in trying to gather transatlantic wide support for its position against China. And that is the topic, that's what concerns me. That is the subject instead of Russia. Iran remains very controversial, perhaps the most controversial issue in transatlantic relations. During Trump's administration, the U.S. withdrew from the Iran agreement. Ever since then, controversies continued. We have the E3 format proposed by Europeans attempting to save this agreement above water. Europeans the sanctions imposed by the US to Iraq. We're talking about the incidents in Iraq that were supported and encouraged by Iran, but there were delimitations like disposal of General Soleimani. An instrument for supporting commercial exchange, supporting trading, avoiding the sanctions imposed by the US, which the US considers is a way of supporting the Iranian regime. Of course, things must be updated. We have a new president in Iran that is going to be validated in August, ultra-conservative, a hardliner. However, they say he might be able to continue the relation with the West. Is portrayed as a religious fanatic. still very far from affirmative. There are some debates in Austria currently, but before the leadership things are standing by. So we can see again, points of cooperation. This is a very complex world between important states. There can be cooperation points, competition points, and even confrontation points. Actually, we're not talking about any kind of confrontation in the transatlantic relation. We can accept that in such profoundly changing world, the world is changing. It's a self-evident statement. You can't avoid it. The transatlantic relation, they say, utilize in the impact of the beholder. It depends on how realistic we are in dealing with the world situation and what our expectations are. There are for and against, pros and cons, but it's important that Article 5's importance was reconfirmed, and I think this is the backbone build around to build on from now on, because that was the red line. And that line was unacceptable in previous approaches. It's quite late. Thank you. Thank you all. We're standing by for your questions or comments. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Natchez. We are now opening the Q&A session. We are thinking it should take more than 30 minutes, given the fact that we're already over time. We're trying, our guests are going to try to answer your questions. We have a colleague with a microphone here. There's another colleague with a microphone on the upper floor. If you just raise your hand if you want to make a comment or ask a question. If you want to address your question to all the panelists, please specify so if it's directed to a specific panelist or a comment, just say so.
So it's a joint question. I'm Dora from Isabel. Can Romania take on the role of mediator in the transatlantic relationship so that it will not be in the position of choosing between mommy and daddy, as Professor Dungaciu was saying, or Professor Bolashoi was saying? Well, who wants to answer? Thank you for this question. In principle, talking about the relationship, that is based on the fact that we are already a member in this transatlantic relationship. We have a number of new instruments as well, or more or less new. The Poland-Turkey-Romania trilateral is almost 10 years old. In 2015, we launched the B9 format as a consultation forum for the Central and Eastern European countries and the 3 Cs. involving Poland, Romania, and Croatia, and all the other states in the region, with an economic component and with the involvement of the American and also German partners as well. So we are also a contributor. This is the second year when we are president. We have the chairmanship of the governing council. There are two aspects: the summit of democracies, undertaken, committed into by the United States, and the Forum for Multilateralism. So a number of instruments connecting and strengthening and building on this relationship. And let us remember the summit declaration that starts with these positions and then introduces a number of joint working groups and institutions with the aim of bringing the position of the two sides to a common denominator. Yes, the United States are more likely to feel the Chinese pressure, but the EU also feels it, and the United States have published a number of documents marking the need of coagulating democracies. So this is also a direct need for both the US and the EU because there is no alternative for the time being. The relations and the reality are such that we can only manage this type of challenge together. Well, I think that, yeah, well, in theory, yes. In practical terms, it's a bit more complicated. And the hypothesis that we start from is not really the best one. There is this idea that the two sides of the Atlantic that have, and that there is some coherence between them. Well, yes, there there are indeed two sides of the Atlantic, but on one side of the Atlantic, in the EU to be more precisely, things are not always easy to reconcile. Sometimes the EU needs to do some reconciliation on its own territory before trying to seek some reconciliation with the United States. Further on, before there was an agreement, economic agreement signed with China by the EU right before the election of Trump. It has been suspended for the time being, but let's wait and see. Mr. Macron said recently that, yeah, well, China might be a threat for the United States, but why do we need to contribute to the American hegemony? Because China is not in the North Atlantic region as defined by the very treaty. Given that China is not located in this region, why would NATO deal with this? How will this position, will this position change in time? Well, we don't know, and it hardly depends on Romania or on any other negotiator or mediator. So there are too many variables, too many elements that are simplified somehow in our discourse. This idea that the two sides of the Atlantic need some reconciliation. Things are much more complex than that. There is this, and Romania's position has been clear. which has been expressed in a number of ways, including in the opening of a new center that is called Euro-Atlantica for a reason. So our commitment is one thing, but being a moderator or negotiator against this background is an entirely different animal. Right, I probably have answered already when I was talking about the level of ambition of countries such as Romania against this background. I would say that Romania has managed to be part of the solutions rather than part of the problems, as some of our neighbors are. And what we can do best is to focus on the risks in the extended Black Sea region. And I think that in this respect, we've been doing a pretty good job. And if we look at facts with respect to the term of Donald Trump, some important investments have been made, some important deployments, and there's more to come. So in this regard, I think that we've done our job as much as we can. If I may, there is this perception that only big players matter. They call the shots, and we can only follow and watch where the ball falls. Well, things are a bit more complex than that. And the actors who may not have such a posture of this magnitude do matter as well. Bilateral relations continue to matter, as well as regional ones. How active a non-systemic state is also matters. You know, it's like a puzzle. If one piece is missing, this will impact the entire puzzle. So this is what we are. We're an important part of this puzzle, without which it is not complete. And I think we should go beyond this paradigm, this tendency of ours to underestimate ourselves, to underestimate the role of states that are seen as smaller, not as strong, and so on. And I think that we should understand that things are a bit more complex than that. And Romania has demonstrated that it can be quite active on the regional arena. And it has been quite active both in diplomatic terms and on the military front, including in terms of strengthening its capabilities. Of course, the systemic dynamic matters, and we need to follow what happens, because we were speaking about this tendency of a NATO that is becoming more, of NATO becoming more and more global. And we were discussing about a possible effect of this, which would be that the engagement could be diluted in areas that are of concern for us. But let us not forget that there is an Article 5, and it has always been underlined that apart from Article 5, it all comes down to the contribution and the willingness of each ally to contribute and to do its part of the deal. And it is very important that we continue to do this and that we continue to make efforts to build on the collective defense potential beyond Article 5. Very briefly, if I could add something with respect to what we can do. It's one thing to take part in the decision making, and it's an entirely different thing to take part in drafting the documents that underpin the final decision. If there is one phrase that is advantageous to us in this new strategic concept or in the deterrence and defense new strategy, or if it can contribute in drafting the defense plans, well, these for us are very important as they will further impact our position and evolution in the upcoming period.
Thank you very much. Next question. I was the national Turkey trying to improve ballistic missiles and nuclear capacity with Russia. President Erdogan Pakistan developed the nuclear weapon program in far precarious economic conditions than Turkey's current economic conditions. And Romania, a security provider in the Black Sea area. Do you have a particular panelist for your question? No. Going to become a nuclear state. It's a signatory of the non-proliferation agreement. It's not the same thing as in Ukraine. Ukraine said that if they're not going to be NATO, they're going to redevelop their nuclear capabilities. It's not going to happen. A bilateral meeting was supposed to be a 5-minute but it took over half an hour. The result was positive. Convergent approaches, apart from public statements and public statements, one in particular was a bit more vehement publicly, but a strategic partner for Romania, the second most important army in NATO, has a wide maneuvering space. Traditionally, it's the interface between former Soviet Union, Iran, and the Middle East. And must not be judged simply because of the political statements of a temporary leader, but it's the sum of all its historical background. We have a very tight cooperation relationship with the heads of staff, so it's a notoriously good relationship. It's not going to break away, but it's a fundamental adaptation issues into the world order can present causes for concern in terms of nuclear programs. That's not true. We are in constant nuclear power, not much else to say, but I think these must be regarded from a wider perspective, also depending on regional temperatures. Now, the regional temperature, if the pressure on the Russian Federation is balanced one way or another, then the relationship between Turkey and the Russian Federation is no longer going to be concerned there. So, even the Russian rockets and ballistic missiles are no longer as important as they seemed at the time. If you look at the surveys at the polls in Turkey, there's an increasing anti-American trend. In the long run, that's bad news. It's always bad news in the long run. Geopolitically, when geopolitics gets in the kitchen, it becomes important. Some geopolitical concerns it doesn't matter. So when people come back from shopping, they will talk geopolitics. If something happens in the South China Sea, that's not a kitchen topic of debate. When the Obama administration reached an agreement with the Kurds in Syria, Turkey read it in a different way than we did. You don't play, that's a Turkish red line, the Kurdish issue. When a strategic partnership between the US and the Kurds, yeah, you can look at it from a different perspective. NATO is part of NATO and had a partnership with the US before the partnership with the Kurds. So no matter how you look at it, someone is going to get offended. Anti-Americanism in Turkey is on the rise, and that's alarming. Erdogan was very wise, if you ask me. After Biden's first gesture, when they recognized, they acknowledged the anti-Armenian genocide, Turkey did not get to the streets. So if Erdogan just winked, and people would have gone to the streets, but they didn't do it. So from that point of view, Erdogan is incomparably more pragmatic than we tend to believe about him. So his pragmatic approach let the temperature cool down because regionally temperatures are going to decrease, theoretically at least. That explains the attitude towards Turkey and some statements that may sound more radical. And Turkey's nuclear ambitions is more a statement made in despair than one based on realities. What I might add, indeed, the concept of strategic ambiguity became famous recently when Turkey was concerned and how Turkey evolved in the Euro-Atlantic space. But if we look strictly at decisions within NATO, you can see that this ambiguity does not have pragmatic manifestation. It's just a discursive dimension. Turkey as a nuclear power, I don't think that's a real topic. I would not recommend our decision makers to even touch this topic. I wouldn't want to add to this. I fully agree. I don't see any topic, any perspective for Turkey as a nuclear power. I would rather say that's a type of interpretation of these actions. Turkey is trying to have a bargaining point, trying to negotiate its status as a regional power. So many of these statements should be interpreted from this perspective of this regional ambition. I would like to address the second part of the question, what we can do for regional security. I think there are quite clear steps emphasized in our national strategy, defense strategy. The Black Sea area is kept on the NATO agenda in terms of what's happening in this region. Secondly, we want coherence on the eastern flank. The advanced post of NATO in the northeast and southeast parts of Europe, there should be coherence and consistency in terms of deploying units. We need more air presence, sea presence, and land presence in our area. And fourthly, we must consolidate our own capacities, which are the ones we should rely on in a crisis situation. What happened at the end of March, mid-April, and beginning of May in our region provides enough arguments in favor of a more enhanced NATO presence in Romania. It has become obvious that when a crisis starts, you should already have military capacities in place. Any displacement of new capacities would be perceived as an escalation of the situation. So it's better to have forces in place before the crisis. Please. We can take one more question and then we're going to finish. Generals, distinguished guests, first of all, as the Vice President for Interinstitutional Relations of the National Defense University, let me address you my thanks for attending this event. Our university finds its right place as a catalyst for all security concerns. Thank you for the fact that both the minister and the head of chief of staff honored us with their presence. They will be advocates of our National Defense University and help us accomplish our mission at the highest standards. I would like to thank participants and supporters of this study, and in particular the co-authors of this Union and Romania. An excellent topic. I would have liked to see a similar topic with a wider approach, with specialists from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, researchers from the intelligence community to add their input, and it could have been part of the national research program. Unfortunately, we don't have such studies in the national research program, not even in the sectoral program. Answers in this respect. A few remarks about the study itself. I would like to thank Professor Adenauer. This is the first time I witnessed her public presence since her leadership of the Institute of Military History, and Professor Bolshoyuk. There might be other specialists absent from this debate. They should take a more pragmatic approach and identify ways of counteracting these threats from a European perspective as well as from a Romanian perspective to provide decision makers with these answers in the interest of national security. I don't think there's any breakage involved in the transatlantic relation. It was the foundation of setting up NATO in 1948. It was the backbone of developing the American concept of interconnecting North American security and European security. As far as what is going on in the Biden age, it's a recharge, if you want, because we're on a predictable path, a path that was predictable 15 years ago, a change of the power factors in the world from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific area. The academic approach, the military academic approach, we can identify back in 2014, if you look at the volumes we provided, the center was forecast to be Asia Pacific. Let's remember what Obama said: if the previous century belonged to the relation between US and Russia, this century is going to be the focus of the American-Chinese relationship. So this is not new. The appearance of Trump continued this approach. As Professor Fifu well emphasized, the shift in the power center must be preserved, and I think we need a consolidation of the eastern flank of NATO. Another approach of the Biden administration was necessary because some European leaders were wondering if NATO is not experiencing cerebral death. Articles 5 and 6, let's not start from mistaken ideas. Article 6 stipulates that in order to activate Article 5, should occur in the Euro-Atlantic space, not necessarily that it should originate in the Euro-Atlantic space. So that article was cancelled, especially given this current strategic concept that NATO is going to act irrespective of where a threat would originate. More than that, European security, including Romanian security, is depending on Euro-Atlantic security. Let's remember the economic threat, the real estate threat. When Romania was thinking it's not going to reach us, the strategic decision in the US is quite clear. The strategic relationship is going to be with China. This is a paradigm change based on our analysis. Okay, what is the question? Our position, perceiving, so my question for the distinguished professors, Romania cannot be a mediator in the transatlantic relationship. Mediator means neutrality and impartiality. We are committed to both the European Union and NATO. We can't be impartial. What would you say are the windows of opportunity based on your analysis and the windows of vulnerability that would have to be narrowed down by Romania, and what opportunity windows should be enlarged to promote the national interest based on our commitment both towards NATO and the EU and the American-Romanian strategic partnership? The challenge from our Vice President, if we need another conference to get into this kind of details, such a question could generate a PhD thesis. Fundamental evidence of the opportunity of the contribution Romania can make to security in the Indo-Pacific area that has become directly interesting. In that area, that can be an opportunity again, depending on how the bilateral relation with our American counterpart finds a fit. Intervention would be, maybe Europeans would get into the way in the Asia Pacific region. There were debates with UK and France, but let's not forget that both France and Germany had their contribution to the naval force trying to block excessive activities in the South China Sea. So the topic is on the table, not necessarily open and approached directly, but it's out for grabs. So yes, one European leader said that NATO is in cerebral death, but then 1 month later changed the new treaty. So automatically, dual position that the second option rejected his first intervention. The final intervention really marks the relationship with China, although Mr. Macron was saying that China is not, has nothing to do with the Euro-Atlantic area. The natural question for any journalist was, okay, so then what was the French army doing in the Indo-Pacific area, since it doesn't concern NATO? After globalization became a fact, there are no exclusive borders. So I agree with the vice president of the university. Out area was an issue in the late 90s, and after that, we're talking about 360 degrees threat. No matter where those threats come from outside NATO, China became part of that agenda, and other planning came as a natural continuation of debates that are very important but already old. Personally, I'm looking forward to the debates to occur later this year in this new formula that I am forecasting, a global NATO, where China is going to be a topic in the alliances. I agree. If the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is willing to cooperate on a study speaking about opportunities, we can debate it a little longer. The question is fundamental in the short run and in the long run. My first suggestion would be to avoid thinking under the spur of the moment. American strategic hegemony has to do with if Taiwan is lost tomorrow and America cannot intervene, that's the end of the American hegemony. Just like Britain was replaced by America is going to be replaced by China if Taiwan is lost. Nobody doubts that there might be some confrontation because of the chips made in Taiwan. In 10 years, the US can manufacture things. So my first suggestion would be not to act or think on the spur of the moment. We're not necessarily talking about a change of world order. I wouldn't recommend any kind of hysteria in any direction. It wouldn't be wise. These are times where you should stand your ground and wait for further developments. If you ask me, what might be a good window of opportunity, I would create an institute focusing on studying China in Bucharest. It wouldn't sound great in the short term, But you never know. I remember with Mircea Molița, who was telling me in '67 when the Chinese president, the Russians didn't even pay attention, and there was an unofficial, Molița was a vice minister of foreign affairs. Chinese leader met Ceausescu, and that debate was important because about China. So when Nixon came to Bucharest, was talking. Your Chinese friends, do you think they can keep a secret? Ceausescu realized that he was involved, not the Chinese friends. And he said, yes, President Nixon, I'm sure I can keep it a secret. I don't know what happened later when Nixon became president. He came for an official visit. He couldn't simply go to China directly. He needed to stop over in Romania without a strategic partnership with Romania. Romania may have been useful. The book dedicated to these events was never published, but that's a strategic weakness for Romania. But I think hysteria of any sort is not recommendable. We should think in the short term what's going to happen beyond the rhetoric that is quite overwhelming, indeed, currently. It's not a serious topic. Very briefly, thank you, Konrad. That I mentioned a breakage. I don't think anyone mentioned any breakage, but we're talking about some animosities and dissonance. And we mention these aspects because we need a diagnostic. We can't come up with a cure without having an X-ray, a full X-ray of current realities and a full diagnostic, whether we like it or not. We're not in a position to wear any kind of tight official suit, so we are at liberty to think and debate these things. So the vulnerability in China, opportunity, that's maybe we have something to offer in this respect to the American interest, and we can turn it into an opportunity for us in relation to vulnerability against China. What is the U.S. willing to offer to other actors, maybe even Russia, to attract them on their side in this obvious adversity with China? Thank you. Let me add something in the end, a few words. There was no change from the administration because a paradigm change would have been represented by exiting the alliance. There were even continuity, elements of continuity. The focus on China and Asia Pacific is an element of continuity that relates not just Biden administration to the Trump administration, but also the Trump administration to the Obama administration, which is when this focus on Asia Pacific started. In my intervention, I mentioned the fact that the American interest to NATO is a very brief window of opportunity. The importance of the American commitment to the partnership with Europe, that is a window of opportunity, and it's very important for this alignment of interest to happen. Interests are somewhat aligned in transatlantic perspective. Yes, the U.S. interest lies in China. The NATO partnership can play a role. In theory, it might be a window of opportunity. In practice, we're going to wait and see how things are moving, making a separate study dedicated to this. There are many elements that can be regarded as opportunities. Perceptions about Chinese systemic challenge, the commitment of the US as a world leader, all of these elements, in theory, may represent windows of opportunity. The real issue is to be able to turn these into practical actions, and I would like to conclude. I am optimistic, but I'm a moderate optimist. These are very complicated issues. We're going to see how interests can be harmonized across the Atlantic. Thank you. From my point of view, very briefly and pragmatically, from a military perspective, there are opportunities and vulnerabilities. The reflection process and reconfigurations occurring currently in NATO and the EU represent an opportunity for us, and we can make a contribution. Secondly, I think we have a window of opportunity at least until 2027 in terms of allocating resources for defense purposes to enable us more credibility and to know what we can rely on in capacity building. Vulnerabilities, to put it elegantly, the fact that we're merely starting to create relevant capacities, we're merely starting to educate a strategic culture that we keep mentioning in our official documents, that should be the underlying factor for any political decision. Thank you very much, our guests. We're proud to have hosted such an event. I would like to thank the Chief of Staff in the National Ministry of Defense and the Minister of Defense himself. I'd like to thank Admiral Konrad, the head of the Chiefs of Staff of the Navy, commanding the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the commander of the Special Operation Force, and all our colleagues. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time. 2 hours and a half was not enough. Thank you all again. And at the end, please allow me to offer you an engraving from the National Defense University. Back in 1937, when this started, and we can't hear the speaker. I'd like to thank you, as well as to invite you to participate in other similar events. With us again as soon as possible. Please, let's have a group photo in front of the building. Mind the steps. Don't slip.